anytime a minority wants change to happen in this country, and by a minority, I mean a minority of people who hold a specific belief or believe that change should happen, they have to convince a lot of people and a lot of their legislators to believe the same thing in order for that to actually get done. You saw it with the fight for gay marriage. I mean, it felt like it was an overnight success, but that took 30 years of organizing and 30 years of convincing hearts and minds. Even when the majority of the country believed that it should have been done, it took a Supreme Court decision. So it is really difficult. And I have the utmost respect for the people who can show up, hear the conspiracy theorists talk about, how much they're evil people and really, and the atrocities that people kind of accuse our government workers of doing. Uh-huh. And still believe in the cause and show up to get it done every day.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com. Caleb, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it is my pleasure to have you here. So, I came across you and your story by way of our mutual friend, Michael Roderick, who has been one of those other people who continually sends me new guests to interview. And every single person he's sent has been stellar, so no pressure at all there. But when he told me what you did and the fact that you managed, a number of digital assets for Barack Obama, I thought, yeah, this is a story we have to tell because this is not just like a typical social media manager job. This is really interesting work about building community at scale and doing a whole bunch of other things. But I want to start by asking you, what social group were you a part of in high school? And what impact did that have on the choices that you've made with your life and your career that have led you to this point?
What an interesting question to start with. Well, I was social groups I was part of in high school. I feel like I kind of was one of those people that carved out my own social niche because I didn't really intentionally fit in with the jocks or with the cool kids or with the nerds. So I kind of hung out with all of them depending on where I was at any given day. Mm-hmm. But I was definitely one of those AP class, students. So I had some hardcore nerdage in high school, and then I did a little bit of theater. So I hung out a little bit with the theater kids, who were always an interesting group. And then I grew up in the South, actually, in Oklahoma. So I hung out with the church kids quite a bit as well.
Hmm. So how did that impact the choices that you made, through college and career wise? What impact did the high school sort of dynamic have later on?
I would say growing up where I grew up definitely gave me a strong sense of morality and right and wrong. And, my grandmother especially was very influential to me about trying to make sure I was making the right life choices and putting a big sense of, social justice and morality and kind of internalizing that for me. Mm-hmm. But it's funny because when I think about that time of life for me, the opposite is also true, where growing up in this, kind of small, obscure, not very culturally diverse city in Oklahoma, very much for me made getting out of it a very top goal from a young age. I was just this is not for me. I want to, go carve my own path. I want to be successful. So reacting against that whole culture I grew up in also has had a pretty strong effect on me, I think.
Walk me through how you go from, high school to college to what you've ended up doing today, and getting to do this work that you've done. Because I said, this is really not one of those things that's probably put in front of you as a potential option for a career.
Yeah, definitely not when I went to college. It wasn't. It's funny because now I've actually taught a couple college courses and speak to classes and have mentored some up and coming, people who want to get into this work. And they actually do teach classes in digital communications and social media and, that kind of stuff now. But when I went to college, none of this was around yet. So, I was always kind of a passionately curious person, and I ended up majoring in history and minoring in music just because I was very interested in those topics and didn't know what I wanted to do yet. You can imagine, those are both very practical things. So my parents were thrilled. But from there, I'd done some volunteer work and ended up working for some nonprofits here in Chicago, and kind of while I was finding my way, and went back to graduate school, actually got an MBA as a way to kind of test out a bunch of different topics, and there got interested in marketing and communications, and especially was interested in the fact that I was taking these courses on kind of the traditional marketing mix and the 4Ps and all of these things you learn in business school, while actually just communicating with people who worked at companies on Twitter every day. And that was a fascinating, dichotomy and between how the world is starting to work now and what we were still learning about how communications was supposed to work. Everyone still had this very mass media mindset. I was seeing these barriers falling and the power shifting back to people, and I found that fascinating. And so I went into kind of digital with that mindset of, I'm going to be part of helping people understand how to take advantage of this new world. And back then we were kind of making it up as we went along. We still are to some extent, I would argue. Mm-hmm. But people didn't really know what they were hiring for, and we were able to, put some strategy in place and actually put some frameworks around how this world should work now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how do you go from there to being, the digital manager for accounts like Barack Obama and BarackObama.com?
So there's always been a long and winding path. And I think that probably the most interesting careers always are. I actually had worked with a few people. I worked for Edelman Digital here in Chicago for a while, and a few people from there had gone on to work for Obama. The Obama organization has pretty deep roots here in Chicago. And so I had worked with a few people who ended up doing some work for the president, and then ended up getting connected to his organization through them, just as on a referral basis.
So I guess, the real question here is, for most of us, that's sort of unfathomable, right? To like manage an account or deal with something that not only has so many rules put in place in terms of communication, just because you're not communicating, on behalf of some brand or some personal brand or something like that. But this is, the leader of the free world effectively, and the most powerful person in the world. So lots of questions, as you can imagine, come from that. I guess, the first thing I'm curious about is, what did you learn about people and human behavior from dealing with such high stakes communication?
Yeah, so there are a few things that I would learn. I'm a big believer in, the fact that when people get together, especially online, they tend to behave differently than they do offline, right? And the reason behind that is something that a professor a few years ago dubbed context collapse, which is that, when I'm just having a conversation with you face to face, I can read your verbal cues, I can understand the social boundaries of the conversation that we're having. Those kind of things don't exist online. And so you can go on any account you want to on Facebook and tell someone off, and you feel pretty good about yourself because you get no consequences from that. Well, imagine that times 1 million people every single day, and that's what's happening. Normal communities that you're managing online, there's a bell curve, right? There's a typical, people on the extreme one end who just love you no matter what you say, and the typical on the extreme other end that hate you no matter what you say. With a normal community, those are pretty extreme and small numbers of people, and most people kind of fall right in the middle of that bell curve of they're reasonable, they want their questions answered, they're interested in what you have to say, they're there for a reason, and with a little bit of nurturing and engagement, you can get what you want out of that community, right? I think at scale, that bell curve actually starts to reverse itself. I think that you get, when you're talking about Barack Obama, or even some of the largest accounts, let's say on Facebook, like Coke, or some of the celebrity accounts, you tend to get your most most of the comments tend to come from the opposite ends of that normal bell curve. So the bell curve actually flips, and you either get the people who completely love you no matter what you do and will comment on it and tell you that, or completely hate you no matter what you do and will comment on it and tell you that. So being able to separate the signal from the noise there in terms of finding the people who are kind of in the reasonable middle, for lack of a better term, is really, really difficult at scale. Mm-hmm. And so for us in politics, you tend to just ignore both extremes. It's true. Like the haters are going to hate, and the people who love you, you're like glad that they're there because they kind of balance out everyone else and make you feel good about yourself. But like at the same time, they're going to love you no matter what you do, so they're not all that helpful. So like you tend to just stick to your message and what's working, and trust that some of those most avid supporters are going to get it out there. But I'd say that what's interesting about it is that you can find ways to engage with people if you can drill down that scale a little bit. So like one of the ways that we did it was we would actually build a community, a kind of branded community for our most active volunteers and supporters, where then we could actually have more one-on-one conversations with them, and we could actually give them helpful information about our strategy or direction about an event they were putting on, let's say. So there are ways to drill down when you're talking about scale. There's ways to give people kind of pathways to raise their hand and actually give you some meaningful behavioral feedback about who actually cares about what you're talking about. And then from a digital standpoint, create experiences for them that are different than just the masses are getting.
So what did growing up in a small town teach you about community that you applied to doing this job?
Oh, that's a great question. It's interesting because it wasn't small to the point of, I could walk down the street to my corner store, like the idyllic movie sense of a small town where everyone knows each other and, all the shop owners and all that traditional like small town community. I would say that what it taught me more than anything was how isolated we can make ourselves in terms of our culture and our experiences, and how we can so easily believe everything around us. Everyone around us believes the same thing that we do. And, we can have conversations with people who believe the same thing that we do and not even understand that there are people out there who, believe different things than us. And I would say that, I was unique growing up in that I sought out different perspectives intentionally and wanted to learn. But it's really easy to be isolated, especially nowadays with our kind of media isolation that we have going on. But, we've got a lot of geographical isolation happening in our country right now, too, where, you don't meet people who aren't like you. And that's kind of a problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's interesting you bring up isolation. I had a chat. I got to sit in on a talk recently where a doctor, I believe it was one of the Summit Series events, where he was talking about the many things that we do to build community we've stopped doing because we seem to think that online communication is a substitute for actually seeing each other in person. And as a result, we're actually dealing with, sort of epidemic levels of unhappiness and anxiety and depression like we've never seen before.
Right. Exactly. And that's because of that, what I was mentioning about context collapse, right? Like we think that it's a substitute for actual in-person community, and it's really not. It's just a shade of it. Mm-hmm.
So I want to come back to this and talk about in-person community and kind of translating online to in-person. But let's come back to that because there's another thread that I want to go down. So you mentioned that you have sort of extreme haters from both sides when somebody either loves you and to like the nth degree, or they hate your guts when it comes to something like this, especially because politics in general are a pretty sensitive subject. Right. I'm curious about any particularly complicated or challenging situations where you've had to deal with people who are just a huge nuisance in these situations that maybe we don't quite understand. And then the other question I guess I have is how do you decide what gets communicated, or how do decisions get made about what actually the world is let in on in terms of what's going on in our government?
Yeah, I mean, we were, as an OFA, we were in an interesting position when it came to the latter, which is that we maintained a grassroots army of 250 volunteer chapters across the country. We maintained, connections with people who were actually going out and doing the hard work of community organizing every single day in their communities on a volunteer basis, which I have utmost respect for. And we tried to be their conduit to what was happening in DC, what was happening in their local government, what was happening at the state level, as much as we possibly could, and be kind of a means of communication for them. But in terms of how we decided what was most important and what our messages were, that kind of came both through the combination of having just a really smart comms director that we had on staff, really smart research director, and having conversations with, the Office of Public Engagement at the White House, with our other progressive partners and friends who are doing interesting work, with people on the Hill who were, introducing legislation, etc., and a lot of people at the state and local level who are, introducing ballot initiatives, trying to get legislation through in their state to do some good, work of change on the local level. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't. There isn't a specific way it would happen. It was kind of a conversation a lot of times between me as a digital director, our communications director, our executive director, to kind of decide, what do our people care about the most? What are our progressive partners doing? What's going to be effective? Like, how can we actually, turn the people that we're communicating with in a direction that's going to be helpful on any given day?
So I don't know about you, but vacuuming is not one of those things that I ever look forward to doing. But as you know, your environment has a huge impact on your creativity. So I still like it to be clean wherever I'm living and working. But now it doesn't have to be something that you deal with. If you're like me and you grew up in the 80s, you probably fantasized about the day when cleaning your house would be like it was for the Jetsons, meaning you don't have to lift a finger. Well, the good news is that we're already kind of living in that future. And the easiest way to make sure your floors are clean every day is with the iRobot Roomba Robot Vacuum. It cleans up after itself. The Clean Base automatic dirt disposal takes convenience to a new level, automatically empties its own bin into an allergen lock bag that holds 60 days of debris and traps 99% of pollen, mold, and dust mites, so you can forget about vacuuming for months at a time. Let the Roomba clean for you instead. It learns your home, finds dirt, and empties itself on its own. It's got powerful cleaning performance made effortless. Remember, if it's not from iRobot, it's not a Roomba. To learn more, go to irobot.com/unmistakable. So you may not be able to answer the question, so no worries if you can't. But how much of the world are we actually seeing when it comes to government? Is a good amount hidden? And the reason I'm asking this question is I just recently watched this Michael Moore documentary, Where to Invade Next. And of course, I know he's super sensationalist, but there are moments when I was like, wow, there's so much information I feel is being hidden from the public. And since I have you here, I'm just curious. I'm guessing there's probably reasons for that as well.
No, well, So I have a few answers to that, actually. I'm glad you brought this up. So anyone who's listening who is worried about a massive conspiracy in our government, let me reassure you that people are not that smart. I mean, it's just true. I was having a conversation with a longtime political aide recently, one of my good friends who's worked both for Obama but for a bunch of other candidates, and has worked in government for a long time. And most of the massive conspiracy theories out there, people just aren't that organized. Our government is run by a lot of smart people, but who are part of a bureaucracy, who are trying to get things done in that bureaucracy. And to think that they could be coordinated enough to pull off half the conspiracy theories that are out there are just kind of laughable. It's just really difficult to do, on top of the fact that information, I truly believe, wants to become public. If it exists out there, most of the time it gets out. I mean, you can see it happening right now on different levels in our government. So anyway, so rest assured that people are not as devious as you think they are. That doesn't mean that occasionally there aren't people hiding things. especially on an individual level, of course, that happens, and we should have a government that's accountable. But any kind of grand conspiracy theories you might have it's probably not happening. So just rest assured that, what you see is what you get for a lot of the time. Our government is run by a lot of very earnest people trying to do what they think is best on both sides and trying to figure out the way to get the work done that they want to get done within a system that is built largely to not get anything done. It's true. Like on the local level, on the state level, you have a checks and balances system that requires a majority of people or a majority of our representatives to vote a certain way on any given day. And it's really, really difficult. Like this is why, who has de Tocqueville called it the tyranny of the majority, or the tyranny of, when anytime a minority wants change to happen in this country, and by a minority, I mean a minority of people who hold a specific belief or believe that change should happen. They have to convince a lot of people and a lot of their legislators to believe the same thing in order for that to actually get done. You saw it with the fight for gay marriage. I mean, it felt like it was an overnight success, but that took 30 years of organizing and 30 years of convincing hearts and minds. Even when the majority of the country believed that it should have been done, it took a Supreme Court decision. So it is really difficult. And I have the utmost respect for the people who can show up, hear the conspiracy theorists talk about, how much they're evil people and, really, and the atrocities that people kind of accuse our government workers of doing, and still believe in the cause and show up to get it done every day. So that's what I would say. And I would also say, just having worked, closely with the White House in the last few years, there's a really interesting educational disconnect between what people believe the president can do and what he actually can do. He kind of becomes a figurehead of getting blamed for everything that is wrong with the government, and don't get me wrong, the president can do a lot of things on the executive level, but especially when it comes to legislation or whatnot, like he can use his bully pulpit, but if Congress is stubborn, he can't do a ton. So I don't know. It's just there's a disconnect, like you said, between the information that is out there and how our government actually works. But I don't actually believe it's because there's a lot of people hiding how our government works. I mean, occasionally that is the case, of course. But I think it's actually just that there's a educational disconnect between what's happening every day and what people actually pay attention to or care about. It's hard to get people to care about the ugly, unsexy work of governing every day. So then something happens and everyone's surprised about it. But, we're out there trying to get things done every single day. And most of the time, it's not that, we're surprising people with a bunch of things that are happening. It's that nothing is really moving, and it won't move until we can get people to pay attention and care about it.
Well, so that's really interesting. My business partner Brian and I were having some conversations about sort of politics and president and campaigns in particular. He said, I get the feeling that people make a lot of promises during their campaigns and are running on all these issues, but that they're not really exposed to reality until they actually get elected. And so as a result, it's much harder to deliver on the things they said they would, because it's kind of like, by the way, this is all the shit you have to deal with that you don't know about after you've been elected. Is that accurate, would you think?
Yeah, I mean, on a certain level, I would say that's accurate, depending on the politician you're talking to, of course. Sure. A lot of people who have experience in government, so they kind of know what they're getting into. And then you could argue that the promises of campaigning are really just campaigning, and they have no intention of actually fulfilling any of those promises. But, that's a different issue, I guess. But then you have people certain businessmen, politicians who actually have no governing experience and actually don't understand how hard it would be to get things done, that are where it's exactly what you're saying. I think that they're probably overpromising, and they even believe that they'll be able to do it.
So I guess, that raises two questions, which, I'm curious about two things when it comes to this: bank bailouts and defense spending. which, I realize are really sort of broad questions, but I get the sense that, at least what we're told, and maybe again, my sources are not entirely accurate because, Michael Moore, I know, is a total conspiracy theorist. I'm just curious, it seems that we've done things like that seem pretty questionable, even from a government standpoint, to say, okay, you know what, we're going to bail out all these billionaires and they're going to pay themselves massive bonuses with these bailouts. And nobody has been, punished or held to any sort of standard for this. And I'm just really curious, kind of having had the front row seat that you did to all of this, what you think about it.
So I'm not going to actually claim to be an expert in either of those things.
Fair enough.
And so, not being the policy guy who is at the table with either the president or any of them to, make any of those decisions, or with defense spending, the people making those decisions are mostly on the Hill. But I do have a couple of what I will call opinions about both of those things and why they exist. Let's start with defense spending. So one of those is defense spending in this country is largely a political maneuver that, because defense spending is, it's proposed by the president, of course, but it's really approved by Congress. Usually defense spending kind of goes up with no ceiling because senators or whoever want to be able to go to their home district and talk about how strong on defense they are. It's all about the bluster of America's got the greatest military, whether or not they actually need the money, that's the insane part. Mm-hmm. Although, the Obama administration has actually, found ways to trim the fat a little bit there, but they still have a gigantic budget, more so than any other, military in the world, all that. So that's, par for the course in terms of our political environment more than anything else. The Wall Street stuff is stuff that I've wrestled with for a while, just, in my own kind of moral wrestling with that. The one thing I will say about the bailouts is that, this is where I think having my MBA and a little bit of economic background is helpful. And I was actually doing business school while the recession was happening. So we had a lot of discussions about that in my business school, which is actually fascinating. But, bailing out the big banks just in a vacuum sounds really bad, right? Like, these people have done awful things. Why would we give them money? But the interconnectivity of our economy right now is insane. And so bailing out a big bank might sound bad on the surface, but the opposite of letting that bank fail actually has a lot of repercussions for everyday people. Like, you're talking about everyday people losing their jobs because their small business couldn't get the money that they needed to continue their workplace. So you're talking about, not bailing out the big banks might be bad for the big banks, but it's also would have repercussions for the rest of the economy. And that's kind of why a lot of those decisions were made in early 2009. So actually prosecuting any of the people on Wall Street, I'm just as frustrated about that as anyone. But I will say, from what I've heard, and this is again just me trying to get a sense of it from people who are there, is that the bar for proving that one person was actually responsible for anything is actually really high and hard to do. Like, it's not just that no one wanted to prosecute anyone. It's that proving that you were the one, pointing a finger at one particular person saying you were the one that was responsible for X, Y, or Z, and having a specific legal, burden of proof to be able to prove that that person did it is actually pretty difficult. So this is, again, one of those things where it's like, we want to think that there's a big government conspiracy, but in my opinion, it's more just because people, like, there's a lot of earnest people who wanted to do the right thing in terms of, like, making Wall Street accountable, but it's really difficult.
Wow. So
yeah,
I want to ask you,
really heady, like, difficult topics.
Yeah, of course. Well, I've been known to do that to people. So, and this is fascinating stuff. And like I said, I'm asking mainly because, like, it's not because I'm biased politically one way or another. I'm just curious about these things, from, getting to hear it from the perspective that you have. One other thing I want to ask you about, you've learned a ton about building community from managing, such a massive community. How do you connect sort of what happens in the online world with what happens in the real world when it comes to communities this massive?
Yeah, great question. So, and that was something that we actually thought about a lot because, like I said, the people that we cared about the most were the people who would show up and, knock on doors and, go to their congressman's office, if we asked them to. And those were really who we considered our people. They were our core supporters. And a lot of what they did was offline, right? So my job as digital director was always to create online experiences that allowed people to raise their hand and gave them a pathway to a deeper experience. So let's say you were a follower of one of our social media accounts, which had millions of people following it, so one of the crowd. What we wanted to do is both educate you about the issues that we cared about, and sometimes even taking a step back from that, it was entertaining you first, right? It was like, here's a funny photo of Bo the dog, and then you're like, oh, that's so hilarious, and that was like the intro to our relationship, which is fine. But then after that, it would be, hey, did you know that, the minimum wage hasn't been raised in X number of years? And hey, did you know that the average person working full time, living on the minimum wage, only makes $14,500 a year on the federal minimum wage? And that's for a family of four below the poverty line, trying to educate you a little bit about the issues that we cared about. And then we would say, do you actually think that this is a wrong thing? And if you do, can you raise your hand and say that you want to do something about this? And then we'd give you an opportunity to get on one of our email lists. And then we would email you about the things that we know that you cared about. So like if we knew that you cared about the minimum wage, we wouldn't email you about every issue under the sun. We might give you the opportunity to raise your hand and say you cared about other issues too, but we tried to respect the fact that you had given us permission to talk to you about this issue. And then when we knew that you cared about the minimum wage, we would say, hey, some people like you are getting together in the Chicago area to, talk about why this issue is important, to do petition drive to get other people interested in it, or, do a paid media event or any kind of number of local things. And then, the relationship would scale from there. So that's kind of how we thought about moving you from online to offline.
Awesome. Well, let's do this. Let's shift gears a little bit. I mean, I'm curious, did you have any personal interactions yourself with the president directly?
I did.
Okay. So I am really curious what you learned about people, success, motivation, and human behavior from directly interacting with somebody like President Obama. This is a hard thing because I truly believe that there are lots of things that a lot of us could learn that would make us better, more successful, better leaders, all of those things. And then I think there are the occasional once-in-a-generation exceptional leaders that, you just can't ever hope to be like, like the Steve Jobs of the world that like we're always going to revere. And I really, truly believe that Barack Obama is one of those once-in-a-generation politicians that like in 50 years we're still going to be talking about. So I hesitate to be like, sure, you can be like Obama in these ways. Sure.
When the president walks into a room, he really commands the room. And you could say that about any president, but I would say that President Obama does it because he's charming and he's relatable and he listens to you and he's funny. And, he does all those things to make you feel like he's an actual person and then also not an actual person because holy crap, you just, we're in a room with Barack Obama.
Uh-huh. So, I mean, dealing with such a high volume of work, the high stakes information, I'd love to talk about sort of your day-to-day habits, routines, rituals. I mean, what is your working ritual like? What was that like in this situation? Like, how do you maintain creativity? How do you stay productive? And was it just sleepless nights constantly? I'm really curious about that aspect of this.
I think I had more sleepless nights at the beginning when I was like worried about being on the Daily Show every day and like messing something up.
Most people would be happy to be on the Daily Show every day.
Yeah. I was just like, oh God, don't let me be on the Daily Show because of an awful typo, like that kind of thing. I mean, there was at one point where, editorial responsibilities kind of all fell on my shoulders. So like if there were mistakes that happened, I was ultimately the one that was accountable to it. So like that's a lot of pressure to put on any one person. And it took me a while to get used to that. But then after a while, you get into a groove and you realize the things that matter and the things that don't, and it's okay. So I would say that I got into, I knew I had a good filtering system for myself, especially with all of our, approval systems. I used email probably more hours of the day than I should. I definitely tried to find a way to not make decisions I didn't have to make. And I would say that my wife was very gracious about taking on a lot of the household responsibilities in the last 4 years. So, Caroline, if you're listening, thank you. I also got to the point, just thinking about decision fatigue and, having to make 1,000 decisions every day about what goes out and what didn't. At one point I was wearing like the same clothes almost every day, or like some version of the same clothes, so that I didn't have to like think about even what I was wearing that day.
Uh-huh. Wow. I'm really curious, once you've left this situation, how you've taken all the things that you've learned about people, about communication, about behavior, and where have you applied them in other areas of your life?
Yeah, if anything, I would say it's definitely redefined what a crisis is for me. I'll say that I don't think anyone could come to me and like, talk about what awful thing has happened. I'm like, oh yeah, that's fine. Other lessons in life. I mean, I would say that one thing that I am striving to do, especially after being around the people who work for Obama and who work for OFA, who are just like the most fabulous people, who are dedicated to the mission, dedicated to making people's lives better in the face of like awful opposition and cynicism is, so prevalent in our country, that those are the kind of people I always want to be around and I always want to work with. People who are insanely smart and insanely hardworking, but have zero ego about it, and who are able to kind of work across titles, across hierarchies, to surface the best ideas. Like the best work that we did in the last 4 years and the most creative work would come from the most inobvious, sources. Just because we would, our intern had a really great idea, we would turn it into a whole campaign. Like we operated like that, and I think that was really, really great. And so being able to work in an environment like that with people that you care about, who are dedicated and really fantastic people, I think is something I'm always going to look for.
All right. So a few last questions for you. What is one book, piece of music, movie, or piece of art, something that has profoundly influenced your life that you would want to share with our audience?
Ooh.
And you can name one of each if you'd like.
Yeah. A couple books I've read recently have had a big impact. On the positive side, I just read a book called Connect by the former CEO of BP, who's making the argument for engaging radically with society, like making the argument that it is stronger for your business to be radically engaged with society and to help make society better than it is to like not do it at all, or to make it just part of a corporate social responsibility effort. He's making the case that it needs to be core to what you do. And I found that really fascinating by the former head of an oil company. But really interesting read. The other is a few years ago, Dave Eggers put out a book called The Circle, which has just like haunted my dreams like ever since. It's about this like fictional social network that is kind of a mix of Facebook and Google and like every like large tech company that you've ever seen, but they basically like take over the world and like inhabit your thoughts by the end of the book, and it's frightening. And like I've always been like, everything that bad happens in technology, I now like relate it back to that book. Yeah, so those are two things for books. What's music? I mean, I'm from Chicago, so Chance the Rapper obviously is near and dear to my heart. Um, yeah, I don't know. Those are things that I've kind of consumed lately, I guess.
Very cool. All right. Well, this has been awesome. So I have one last question for you, which is how we finish all of our interviews with the Unmistakable Creative. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
Well, I think that it is a mission, honestly. I think it's you always hear people talk about finding your passion and finding, the work that really drives you. And I think that's kind of BS. Like, I think that the people that you want to be around are mission-driven people, and the people who have found their purpose and their way to kind of make change in the world in their own small way. And those are the people that I've found that I want to surround myself with. And the people who, are about more than money, they're about more than themselves. If I could leave, your listeners with anything, I'd say it's find your mission, find the thing that the way that you can contribute your skills to making the world just a little better.
Well, this has been amazing. I can see why Michael referred you. Where can people find out more about you and what you're up to?
You can follow me on Twitter at Caleb Gardner. I'm going to be, at a few conferences in the fall if you want to come to those. CalebGardner.com, or find me on Medium if you want to see some of my writing. I'm going to dip back into that now that I've kind of come out of my shell, out of the political world. So yeah, please keep connected.
Very cool. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that. Next time on The Unmistakable Creative.
Well, see, comics was always my backup plan, because my main plan was to be a Major League Baseball player.
Really?
And I held on to that dream probably until, like, age 13, when I realized that I couldn't hit a curveball. And was a scrawny little Jewish kid. But that was my number one goal. That was what I thought about and was obsessed about for a long time. But the comics was sort of something I always did. It was just so much part of who I was. Like when you're the only kid in your class who can draw, you sort of become, the star, or, when certain things are needed to be done, when a Superman has to be drawn, or when there's a mural that needs to be done, or when someone wants you to draw a horsey because they love horses, that was nice to have that kind of attention.
Josh Neufeld joins us to talk about the art of making comics.